So I'm particularly thankful that I didn't have any travel plans this weekend. And I'm even more thankful that you didn't have any travel plans, or at least if you did, they fell through and you happen to be here today. But I want to begin with the question, has this been your experience? Have you ever left a place that you considered to be your home? Perhaps it was a place where you were born and raised, that you grew up there. Maybe it's a place where you lived for an extended period of time, a place where you had good friends and family that lived there. And you had to leave there. You left there for whatever reason, and you were gone for an extended period of time and then returned, either to visit or to live again. What was that like? Well, from a personal experience, I was born and raised in Guayaquil, Ecuador. My parents were missionaries there. And I grew up on the streets of the city. We didn't have parks. We played soccer. We put up rocks at either end of the street, dodged buses and cars as we played soccer out in the street. And so at 17, because I survived those first 17 years there, they decided to send me to Canada. I was supposed to continue my education here, and that's a whole different story. But I was here not really because I wanted to, but because they figured I should be here to have greater opportunities for education and jobs and career and that sort of thing. I went back after 5 years. I was 22 when I headed back. I actually threw a backpack on I was one of those 60s, or actually early 70s guys that threw a backpack on and hit the road. I traveled down through Mexico into Central America, got to San Jose, Costa Rica, and then decided I needed to get home in time for Christmas, so I jumped on a plane and flew in. And I still remember arriving there as the plane landed and having this anticipation of coming home. And when I got off the plane, I had that welcome blast of hot, humid air, which always made me feel like, oh, now I'm home. And survived the trip between the airport and home. That was always an experience, driving in a car in the city of Guayaquil. And I found that for the most part, the city that I grew up in and the places that I lived and I still had friends there hanging around, nothing much had changed. But the reality is I had changed. And so that was a bit of a disturbing thing, that I had changed. I've had the occasion to go back and visit several times. Most recently, I guess it's about 7 years ago in 2016, we traveled there, my wife and I, and we traveled around for about a month. And now I realize that not only I had changed even that much more, but it wasn't the same place I left. You know, the nostalgic notions you have of home, and you get back and you're really disappointed that, well, I guess progress hits every place and it isn't the place you left behind. I think it's John Steinbeck in a book that he wrote called Travels with Charlie, which is, his subtitle was In Search of America. And he sets out in 1960 to travel around the United States. He was an author. And he ended up at one point back in San Francisco, which is where he had lived for I think he was born and raised there. He lived for an extended period of time. But he came out with this great statement. He said, "You can't go home again because home has ceased to exist, except in the mothballs of your memory." And that's just so true. Home, really, as you knew it, when you've been gone for extended, only exists in the nostalgic memories that you have of what it was like to be there. Many of course, aren't maybe as real as the experience was when you lived there. Yet it seems that when troubles hit hard and life as you know it begins to fall apart, it seems that one of the first places we head for is home. And that again has been my experience at a time, a few years into our marriage, and things weren't going very good. And life was starting to fall apart. And I thought I needed to go home. And that was another disappointing trip, although a very important one in my life as well. We look for home because there's a longing for the safety and the security and the stability that presents in an unstable time in our lives. Well, last Sunday in our study of the story that is told in the book of Ruth here in the Old Testament, we left off with Naomi heading for home in Judah along with her daughter-in-law Ruth. And we left off with this verse at the beginning of verse 19. It was read for you starting with verse 19, where it said, "So the two of women, that is Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem." They said goodbye to her sister-in-law Orpah, who stayed behind, and we'll get to that and talk about that in a minute. And then they headed on and they traveled through. And then in the last part of the verse 19, it says, "When they arrived in Bethlehem." Now, sometimes we read these things and you realize there's no gap there. We don't stop to even take a breath and we keep on going. But between that first part of that verse and the second part of the verse, there's at least a few days, if not a whole week, went by. Because the travel from Moab to Judah was not an easy one. And it was one that was probably not recommended, or it was highly unusual for women to travel alone. It was not a very safe road to travel. It was a very rugged trip for the two of them. And so the storyteller here doesn't tell us much about the trip, but he jumps from the continuing on the journey to saying goodbye to Orpah to their arrival in their destination. And so there's this gap of time of at least a few days, if not a whole week there. Now, this is my mind, the way my mind was. When I see a gap in time and somebody doesn't fill me in the details, my mind starts filling in the details. And by the way, with Scripture, that's dangerous because you start reading things into it that may not be there. But just the same, I started thinking about, okay, so what was that trip like? What did they talk about as they traveled along the road? Did they talk at all? Naomi seems to be in a very depressed state of mind, and understandably so. She's just lost her husband as well as her two sons in the last number of years. Was there any conversation at all? What was that like? What were Naomi's thoughts and feelings as they begin to approach her hometown of Bethlehem? You know, as they begin to pass different areas, and perhaps she became overwhelmed with those memories of the times when she was just beginning to know Elimelech, her husband, and they were, I guess dating didn't occur in those days in the way we know it today, but there was a courtship where they were hanging out, maybe in a grove of trees, of course in public with a lot of people to see that nothing untoward was taking place. Was she thinking about an area where her two boys, when they were little, used to play in, and she could envision those memories of what that was like? Did she think of the hopes and dreams that she and Elimelech had for these two little boys when they were first born and they began to raise them in this territory? Was she overwhelmed with memories about what it was like when they decided to leave her town of Bethlehem, which is ironically stands for house of bread, during a famine when there was no bread to be around, and Elimelech, being the husband and the father and the caregiver, the provider, felt they needed to go someplace where he could find food to put food on the table, and they chose to leave for Moab. Does she remember leaving there as a happy family, and now in great contrast, she comes back as a widow, but not only as a widow, but without her two sons who had died as well? Must have been a flood of memories, and some of them very overwhelming to her. But the arrival also caught most of the town by surprise, a little bit by surprise. Now you have to understand, Bethlehem was just a little place of probably just a few hundred people at the most. And it was unusual for two women to arrive alone anyway. And so the question might have been going around, the question as they see these two women arrive, who are they? What are they doing here? How come they're traveling by themselves? But then as they grew closer, then they begin to identify, and ask the question, is this Naomi? Now remember, she's been gone for a little bit over 10 years probably. She's been through some really tough experiences, and that begins to wear and tear on your appearance, doesn't it? Have you ever had that experience, or have you come across somebody you haven't seen for a good number of years and they've been through some tough experiences? Maybe it's just the aging process. I have connected with some older friends, and I think, man, they've grown old. And then I realize I look in the mirror, and Diana tells me, well, look in the mirror, Don, you've grown old too. I remember when our photographs for our driver's license went from color to being black and white, and I just about disappeared from the picture because it was only gray. And so all of a sudden you find this, they're starting to recognize and say, oh, is this Naomi? How come she's by herself? Didn't she leave here with a husband and 2 boys? Why is she coming? And who's that woman with her? And they begin to talk about that and to spread the word around and perhaps even gossip a little bit about it. And at some point, Naomi, I think, overhears what takes place. And she answers. She says, well, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because Naomi means pleasant and Mara means bitter. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full. She's no doubt remembering all about that. But the Lord has brought me back empty. And literally, she really puts this as full I left, empty God brought me back. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. I don't know about you, but the tone that comes across to me is somebody who's pretty angry. Definitely pretty bitter by her own admission. And note in particular how she refers to God, the Almighty, El Shaddai. In other words, God, the one who's powerful enough to do anything he wants to. The God who could have intervened on my behalf but did not. And she refers to him as Lord, which in our modern translations have had small capitals. It has reference to the word Yahweh or Jehovah, which was the covenant name for God. In other words, she's saying, God the Almighty, the God all-powerful whom we worship, the God who's entered into a covenant with us to look after us and take care of us, he did not intervene and he did not take care of. He's made my life very bitter. She's blaming God for all the things that have taken place in her life. Beware, bit of a word of warning, of forming your belief about God based on the expression of somebody who has gone through an experience and is themselves in a very depressed state and quite bitter and angry. Well, probably a different one of us have at times been there. Beware of attributing to God the fault for things that have taken place in our lives just because we happen to be broken people living in a broken world, with the consequences of not only our brokenness but the brokenness of others. I've said this before, let me say it again. Sometimes we say, well, why doesn't God do something about this? And I suspect God is saying, I left you in charge of the earth. Why aren't you doing something about it? Think about that next time you see something that you think this is wrong or this somebody should do something about this, and ask yourself, is there something that God would want me to be doing something about this to improve this part of the world, to make this world part of the world where I am right now a better place to live? But in all of this, in all the arrival, Ruth is not mentioned. Ruth is not spoken about at all. So what about Ruth? She seems to have been left right out of the picture by the storyteller. Naomi makes no mention of her, nor do the townspeople seem to make any their questions or ask about her. Yet you have to wonder, what were her thoughts and feelings when the end of this journey came into sight? Remember, she's the one that made the decision to stay with Naomi instead of staying behind while her sister-in-law stayed behind. And I think it must have begin to now sink into her that she was about to find out everything that would be involved with living out that decision of her life. That everything that she knew and was familiar with had been left behind. And now she had arrived in this land where she would now be the foreigner, needing to learn a new language, learning how to live within a new culture, knowing what she was able to do, what she was not able to do. And hers was going to be very indeed a steep learning curve. Was she doing what so many of us would probably do in the same situation? And maybe you've been here when you've made a major decision and then all the consequences of that decision come to bear and come into reality, and you say, what was I thinking when I did that? Some of us got married, and after we got married, we were thinking, what were we thinking about getting married? And there's this whole adjustment that realizes that now you live with this person 24/7. They live with you too, by the way. And it's a whole different matter than dating and dropping that person off at the end of the date and going home and being on your own. I wonder if Ruth wasn't thinking that when she arrived here, saying, what on earth was I thinking about? But that's where I want to pick up, and I want to turn our attention to here this morning, and that is to the decision that she made way back in Moab, in contrast with the decision that her sister-in-law Orpah had made, and even in contrast to what it meant for Naomi to make that decision to return to Bethlehem. I mean, Naomi, after all, was returning home. That was not necessarily a very hard decision for her to make, given the situation that she found herself in. But for Ruth, it was a different matter. Her situation, if we remember right, her husband had died, as had her brother-in-law, Orpah's husband, around the same time. And a few years before that, her father-in-law, Elimelech, had died as well. And while the storyteller makes a point of saying that Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband, both Ruth and Orpah were also left behind without their husbands. They were also facing a very uncertain future, not knowing how that was going to unfold or develop for them. It was a time of deep change. But you see, changes in our lives are often prompted by times of significant loss and the subsequent pain, often emotional pain, that we experience. And it is in this experience of significant loss that we are confronted with a moment of decision. The question demanding an answer is one we touched on last week, but is this: what will I do now? Given everything that's taken place, that was out of my control. I can't change what has happened. I can ask all the questions about why that has happened. We can spend a lot of time that we can even get stuck back there with that why question and probably never even find a satisfactory answer to that. But the question eventually that we have to deal with is, what now? What do I do now? It's a moment of decision. In Orpah and Ruth, we have 2 contrasting ways in which that question was answered by the decision made by each. Now, it would seem that initially both had made the decision to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem. And the storyteller is quite clear in what he says there. He says Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there, meaning where they were living in Moab. And then he goes on to say, with her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living, and they set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So it appears that initially, at least, they were all 3 of them together on the fact that this was the future that they needed to pursue. This is the direction that they needed to go in their lives. But it also seems that somewhat along the way, soon after perhaps they started out on the journey, Naomi has second thoughts about the wisdom of Orpah and Ruth going with her all the way to Bethlehem. I mean, a possible question she was going to be asking herself along the way is also dawning, is how am I going to explain these 2 ladies? After all, Moabites were not exactly welcomed in Judah. How are they going to find husbands here? My own sons married them. That was totally against the norm, but we were living in, she would think we were living in Moab where there weren't any other choices, so they married Moabite women. But they're not going to be very eligible to find a new husband back in Judah. I think she also had their best interests at heart. So part of it was a little bit selfish, a little bit self-centered. I'm reading into this again, a dangerous thing to do. But I think she was also thinking they're really better off staying where they know life, where they're safe, where they know how to fit into life as it is. And so she tries to persuade them to turn back and go home. In other words, she's saying to them, stick with what you know. Stick with what is safe. Where you will be best fit into the way of life, where you are most likely to find another husband. Ruth and Orpah find themselves then at the fork in the road, at this junction in their journey through life. And that metaphor of journey is very prevalent in this first chapter of the book of Ruth. There's 12 uses of some form of the word to that's translated return, and there's another 10 that are translated to go or to walk. So in 22 verses, there's 22 mentions of being on the road, being in a journey, going to some place or returning from place. Life is often like that. It's compared to a journey. And here we had Orpah and Ruth are at this junction, at this fork in the road. I'm old enough to remember a catcher who played for the New York Yankees by the name of Yogi Berra. And some of you are saying, who are the New York Yankees? Okay, so forget that nonsense. But he had some great different sayings that didn't make a whole lot of sense all the time. And when I see this one, the coming to a fork in the road, he says, when you reach the fork in the road, take it. And I'm thinking, that's really helpful. That doesn't help at all. But anyway, they have to take one direction or another. That's where they are. They're confronted with the events of life, and they now have a choice that neither one of them wanted to ever have to be faced with making. Probably totally were unprepared at all by anything that happened in life to make that choice, but they're confronted with this decision that they need to make. Would they play it safe and go back to the life they knew and were familiar with, where they knew their place in society and what was expected of them, their role as women there, which was to get married and bear children and raise a family. And that was the only role that was expected of a woman back in their time. Where they could fit in and simply be accepted for who they are. Where they would have the best chance of finding another husband and who would provide for them and take care of them. So would they play it safe? Or would they step out of the question and into the mystery of a new beginning, a new life, a new path in life that was being opened up to them with all the inherent risks that went along with stepping out of the familiar and comfortable and moving into the unknown? And the words that I had quoted last week from another author, she says, loss is simply an invitation to begin another life, to take on the rest of life, to develop to the fullness of the God life within us. But it is an invitation that we either accept or we turn down. Which would you do? Orpah opted to turn back to Moab, choosing to remain who she had always been, a good Moabite woman. And it's important to note that the storyteller offers neither praise nor condemnation for the choice she makes. In fact, as one person put it, it's an obvious choice. It's a highly moral one, a clearly transparent one, the undeniably correct social one, a traditionally spiritual one. And dare I say, it's probably the choice most of us might have made given the same circumstances, same situation. We would opt for the safe. We would opt for the comfortable. We'd opt for what we know and stick with that rather than taking the risk of the unknown. And so the author says she kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But the storyteller tells us that Ruth clung to Naomi. And that word for clung is the same word that in Genesis is translated between a husband and wife as a husband cleaving to his wife. That's a very close union. It's sticking, saying, I'm not going to depart from you physically, stating what she didn't state it in words as well. See, Ruth sees with different eyes the opportunity that before her to become so much more than she is right now. But while the choice for her seems clear, the decision could not have been an easy one. And if we only see with our 21st century perspective and try to understand it from that point, we will fail to understand the great amount of courage it took for her to make the decision that she did. Hear what she is saying again, and her strongly expressed commitment not only to Naomi, but to Naomi's God. Your people will be my people. She's turning her back and saying, I will no longer be a Moabite. I will now be one with you and adopt your culture and your religion as mine. She's leaving her own people, the culture in which she had grown up and lived all her life up to that point, to adopt that of Naomi's. She says, your God will be my God. This is a conversion of sorts. She was leaving behind her religion, adopting Naomi's. And she adds later, quite significantly, may the Lord, and here she uses the covenant name for God, may the Lord deal with me. In other words, she's already putting herself and saying, I'm converting over to your system of belief in God. I have seen something that I want for myself. May the Lord deal with me, however severely, if I don't follow through with all of this. She goes on to say, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. It's a lifelong commitment that she's making to Naomi and to her God. It's not saying, I'm going to go with you so to make sure that you're well taken care of. I'm going to look after you. But once you die, Naomi is an older woman by that point, I will go back to my own people. She has no plan B. This is the only plan that she has. She plans to go, face whatever it takes, do whatever it has to done to adjust to that life and be part of life in Judah. Ruth is clearly rethinking and redefining for herself who she is as a woman in her day and age, and who God is for her and in relationship to her. This was a life-changing decision. It was a total reorientation of her life that was going to take place. You see, we make our decisions, and then our decisions make us who we are. You and I today, wherever you are, however old you are, however young you are the product of the decisions that you've made leading up to this point in your life. See, the decision you make, the decision we make, and not just in the major decisions of life, but almost every day of our lives, the decision we determines the direction that our lives take. Look back just for a moment over the course of your life, and I'm sure you can already identify some significant decisions that you've made that altered the course of your life. I mean, some of the obvious ones are marriage, maybe university, maybe where you chose to study, maybe it was a mission trip that you chose to go on. But there are also some decisions that you made some time back a ways that have also altered the course of your life. And when you made those decisions, you didn't even fully realize how much that would alter the course of your life. I didn't adjust very well to being in Canada. I did 2 cracks at grade 11. And then I got partway through grade 12 and said, that's it, I'm done. I dropped out of school. I don't think I would be standing here today if I had completed high school and gone on to university the way I had planned to, following the course of study I had planned to do. That decision, while at the time was not a hard decision to make, but one that I was saying, this is temporary, I'm going to go back and make this up, and I'll get back on track. It was one that never happened the way I planned it or thought it would happen. It was a decision that I made in a moment of time, thinking that this is only for now. You too are probably making decisions in your life or have made decisions in your life that you thought, this is just for now. And then it altered completely the course of direction of life. The decisions you make determine the direction that your life will take. And that is so true with Orpah and Ruth. Orpah makes the sensible decision, the safe one, to go back to her home, and we don't hear from her again. She may have lived out her life in a very happy way, in the safety and security and stability of the life that she knew and had grown accustomed to back in Moab. We simply don't know. Ruth instead takes the risk and steps out in faith, trusting in the God of Naomi, and she leaves behind what is known and comfortable to follow a path that she knows not where it will take her. And in the process, she becomes part of a much bigger story that continues to unfold in the world even today. She becomes part of the family that will not only produce the greatest king of Israel, King David, but in time be the family line out of which Jesus himself comes from. Now you have to understand that both were possibilities that Ruth had no way of knowing and could not have known or expected. And even the original storyteller could not have forecast that one time down the road a Messiah would come. There was not even a concept that was in existence in their day when this story was being told. Yet out of that heritage, when we get to Matthew and we read through the lineage family line of Jesus, we find Ruth mentioned there. Well, it's hard to say what the difference in Ruth, what made the difference in her for her to make that choice. Perhaps it was living with Naomi over the last number of years and observing how Naomi lived out her faith in a practical, everyday way that slowly begin to cause Ruth to question and find herself increasingly at odds with her own culture and her own religion. And perhaps along the way, she became increasingly at odds or began to question her own role in life as well as a woman. And instead of taking the well-worn path that others would have had her follow, she sets out on a far more difficult, but also far more fulfilling path to discover who she really is, who God created her to be, and to live out God's story for her life rather than the story that others were wanting for her, perhaps even trying to force her to live. See, I think in many ways, Ruth is the patron saint for all women today. All women who are desiring and striving to be who God created them to be in the face of pressures to be somebody else that the culture, society, or the world around us wants them to be. Living out a story that God has created for them rather than the other story that others want to tell about them. As I was preparing this and I was listening to music as I often do, and the song by Lauren Daigle came on, and you may know the song called You Say. Let me read just a few words of the lyrics from that song. She sings this: I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know. You say, speaking of God, I am loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I am strong when I am weak. And you say I am held when I am falling short. And when I don't belong, you say I am yours. And I believe. What is it that you believe about your relationship with God? So what about you? As it was with Ruth, so it is with us. We make our decisions, and then our decisions determine the direction our lives take and make us who we are. We have the same choice that was before Ruth. We can play it safe, go with what we know to be, and be who we are told we should be. Live out the story that others would want for our lives and others would want to write for us. Or take a risk and step out in faith, inviting God to co-author our story along with us. 3 things I have observed to be values held today, and I think they're right across cultures, right across different groups, right across religions. And they're not bad values, they're good values. They're what I call the 3 S's. Safety, security, and stability. Great values to have. But here's the problem. You see, if you are a follower of Jesus, and these 3 values trump everything else, and they're the primary aspects or factors that are involved in your decision making, with heart in hand, let me say to you, you will find it very difficult at best, if not impossible, to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus. See, Jesus does not invite us into a safe, secure, and stable life. He invites us into a life of faith. And how do you spell faith? R-I-S-K. See, where there's no risk, you don't need faith. If you got everything charted out in your life and planned out and you have it all figured out, you've kind of planned it out according to your resources and your abilities and gifts, you don't need God either. See, you can do it all on your own. The God life was meant to be lived in the strength and the power that God gives us. And you can only follow Jesus in the direction that He takes you, the direction He determines for your life, in dependence on Him. And that will often involve insecurity, danger, and instability. The choice is ours. See, you have a story to live and to tell others about as well. The question is, what will be the story that your life tells? What will be the story that successive generations tell about you? Will it be like Orpah's, who played it safe and lived out her life in obscurity? It will be the story like Ruth's, where you may be not written about in any kind of book someplace, but you will have made a difference, significant difference in the world for the kingdom of God. The decision is yours. God puts the pen in your hands, but He offers to co-author the next chapter of your life with you, if you're willing to follow that. Thought just on closing here that prepares us for where we're going to pick up the story along the way next week. And yes, I get to come back next week. The story has been a bit of a downer up until now, hasn't it? I mean, there's a famine, people are dying, people are trying to make heads and make sense out of life that doesn't make sense. But there's this positive ending to the chapter here that alerts us to things are beginning to change. Remember when Naomi and Elimelech and her two boys left Judah, left Bethlehem, they left in a time of famine. But it says, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. As I got ready for today, I think God impressed on me that's something I had to say today. Hopefully God is saying through me. It was not taking credit. God putting a message on my heart was specifically for somebody sitting here today. Hopefully there's something in all of it that connects with every one of you. But if you're that person who God has connected in a very specific way today, then I would love to talk to you further about it. Or reach out to one of the elders or one of the pastors here. If God is at work in your life, open up and listen to what He has to say. The direction He wants to lead you. The decisions that maybe are involved that aren't easy ones, but will make all the difference if you decide to step out in faith and the God who loves you and cares about you and has a wonderful, phenomenal purpose for you being on this face of this earth today. Father, thank you that you care about us, that you, who are the Almighty God, who are our Creator, you know our names. We sometimes feel insignificant, but we are not insignificant to you. You see us where we are. You see our experiences in life. You've been there even when we have not felt your presence. And you invite us into fulfilling your plan and your purpose for our lives in a very significant way. May we be open to hearing from you in a new way today and walk through that door to a new life that is ours through Jesus Christ. For us in His name, amen.